There are 4 groups of active nuclear power reactors in the Ukraine. If any one of them get in the way of a war, their radioactive particles could be released and cause a Europe-wide disaster.
But it's kind of backed away from this kind of stance in recent years, saying that Taiwan is already independent, and so there's not a need to declare independence. But for China, the red line is shifting. It's always just whatever they say it is.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. A few days ago, the Washington Post noticed that the government of Ukraine had a Twitter feed that included some witty memes. Here's one using a Simpsons picture. This one about headaches with the same message. What they say about NATO. And this one, whether you agree or not, it's pretty funny. These memes spurred us to show the memes of promoting enduring peace and other pictures about the situation between Ukraine and the Russian and U.S. empires. We start with the last year of the Soviet Union, when it allowed East Germany to unite with the West and join the NATO military alliance on the understanding that NATO would not move any further east. Ukraine became independent in 1991 when the Soviet Union crumbled. The head of Russia at that time, Boris Yeltsin, recognized the independence of Ukraine. At that time, there were 300 nuclear weapons inside of Ukraine, so the country suddenly became an important nuclear power. In 1994, the Ukrainian government agreed to give up all the nuclear bombs in exchange for security guarantees. At a meeting in Budapest, Hungary, Russia agreed to the existing borders of Ukraine, and Crimea was in those borders. As the years passed, the United States went back on its word and expanded NATO east in a big way. In 2014, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians massed in their Independence Square in Kiev and eventually chased out their corrupt and violent president. The new Ukrainian government foolishly adopted measures that would have put Russian speakers at a disadvantage. Putin took advantage of this to violate the Budapest Memorandum and to openly seize the Crimea and to take the Donbass with so-called Russian volunteers. In the resulting warfare, 14,000 people have died. Russia now has a huge military force on the border with Ukraine and menaces that country, though it claims that it is Ukraine that is threatening Russia. Throughout the crisis, there is almost no mention of the obligation of Russia, the United States, and Ukraine to take the dispute to the United Nations. It is international law. Now is a good time to mention nuclear reactors. Probably most American adults have heard of Chernobyl and the catastrophe of 1986. The reactors at Chernobyl have stopped, but the radiation at this point is just contained. There are 4 groups of active nuclear power reactors in the Ukraine. If any one of them get in the way of a war, their radioactive particles could be released and cause a Europe-wide disaster. Now, a series of memes mocking the ambitions and pretensions of the empires. And one wondering why no one in Congress is opposing the march to war. One idea for a path forward: real neutrality for Ukraine. And from a Ukrainian writer, Taras Bilus, another practical suggestion: put a UN peacekeeping force in the Donbass. That would make it very hard for either Ukraine or Russia to mount an offensive. Putin, Biden, no war over the Ukraine. More about this in the archive Promoting Enduring Peace maintains about Ukraine and Russia. Click first on their Resources tab. We have learned that in addition to being blindfolded and handcuffed, he was also gagged during that fateful hour on January 12th. Eyewitnesses say that Israeli soldiers hovered over him, and one put some kind of fabric over his face and then just left. The Israeli army claims that its soldiers said that they thought he was just asleep. We at the Middle East Crisis Committee created a petition calling for justice. In addition, we've decided to have a special page on this killing by negligence. Go to the struggle video.org, click on the struggle, and scroll down to our campaign page. Here's part of Democracy Now!'s treatment of a home demolition in Jerusalem that we mentioned on the program last week.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. An Israeli court has rejected a petition by a Palestinian family to let them rebuild their home in the Shaykshira neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem, a week after the Israeli military destroyed their home, demolished it. On January 19th, Israeli forces raided the home of the Salhiyeh family early in the morning while the family slept. Several members of the family were assaulted. At least 6 were arrested. Mahmoud Salhiyeh and his daughter Yasmin spoke about what happened.
At
2 a.m., my son woke me up and said that the army are entering the house. I couldn't leave the room. They came in and arrested me. They stepped on my back, and the officer said, "I told you I will come, evict you from your home, and I will let you leave your house like a dog, barefoot." He stepped on my back and told me, "Put your head down." I told him I never put my head down.
The house was demolished. I saw videos and live videos. My heart is broken. I don't know how to express myself. The house that I was raised in now is torn up. Everything in the house is gone. The feeling is so hard to see that my father's hard work for 25 years is demolished. Our memories, my father's heritage in this land, everything is gone. Even the cats and animals that were raised in the land are gone.
At least another 18 Palestinians who were at the home in solidarity with the family were also detained. Palestinians say it's the latest in a series of evictions aimed at expropriating land for Israeli settlers in violation of international law.
And now another trouble spot, U.S.-China relations. One aspect that is rarely considered by the left is the question of Taiwan. For a long time, almost all the left considered Taiwan just a stolen part of China that was under the dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek, supported illegitimately by the United States Navy. But after all these decades, things have gotten much better on Taiwan, and certainly people living there have much freer political rights than those living under the yoke of the Chinese Communist Party. I interviewed Brian Hioe, a young writer living in Taiwan. I'll be speaking to Brian Hioe. He's a founding editor of New Bloom, which is a website in Taipei, Taiwan. And that's where he is right now. Good evening.
Thanks for having me. Good evening. Or good morning to you, rather.
Yeah, it's quite a time difference. I believe 13 hours.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about New Bloom. What is New Bloom that you helped found?
Mm-hmm. So New Bloom is a left-wing publication. It's a publication, but we do online primarily. But we do zines, one periodicals, maybe like once a year. We have a podcast as well. And we also run a activist space, community space in Taipei. And so we were founded in 2014 out of the Sunfire movement. We were participants in the movement or people that were involved in organizing solidarity efforts overseas. And so we felt there's a need to push for these perspectives that are critical of both the US and China, not relying simply on one to ward off the other. So in this kind of age of inter-imperial rivalries, we wanted to kind of push for a left-wing stance on self-determination for Taiwan that is not just relying on the US to counter China. And so that's what we were founded with the mission of doing. And that was about 7 years ago. So I was one of the founders, and I've been doing that since then, more or less.
You referred to something that happened in 2014. If you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, of course. So the Sunfire movement was the month-long occupation of the Taiwanese legislature by student activists. That was in protest of a free trade agreement that was to be signed with China. The ruling party was the KMT, the Kuomintang, the former authoritarian party, which had again taken power after democratic elections were introduced to Taiwan. And so there was this fear of resurgent authoritarianism. And despite the fact that the KMT had fought with the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, in the Chinese Civil War, and then fled to Taiwan, becoming an authoritarian force that ruled over the population for decades, it had become more friendly towards China. It was intent on pushing for unification, despite the fact that this is maybe not the will of what Taiwanese people feel, fear of losing democracy, etc., identity trends that signal identification with Taiwan rather than China. And so this is what the movement was in protest against. That was in the years after Occupy Wall Street. So it was this kind of Occupy style movements. Those were still taking place across the world. And there was kind of discourse around free trade as well, because it was a free trade agreement. And, you know, those effects are not usually great for average people. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm quite old, so if you could talk a little slower, I would get it more. I appreciate that. So let me jump right into the most pressing question. Russia has 100,000 troops and is threatening to invade Ukraine. The Chinese government smashed the democracy movement in Hong Kong. Are people in Taiwan afraid of a Chinese invasion?
So I think it's one of the interesting things because it is a long-term fear. I think people in Taiwan have they are afraid of a Chinese invasion, but this has been around as a threat for decades. China has had thousands of missiles pointed at Taiwan for years and years and years. And so it's not anything new. In the past year, one has seen an escalation in the Chinese threats directed at Taiwan. Most often this comes in the form of warplanes that are sent to airspace near Taiwan. And sometimes this occurs on a daily basis. China between October 1st and 5th, right after Chinese National Day, deployed something like 150 warplanes to airspace near Taiwan. But people in Taiwan, I think life just goes on. I think people are not too afraid of it. It doesn't seem like a near short-term possibility, but it does seem like something that people are afraid of in the long term.
Some people in the US say that Taiwan's government has been provocative by electing the DPP party, which says that Taiwan is independent of China. What do you think?
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting because the DPP is historically a pro-independence party. It has pushed for Taiwanese independence and not unification with China. But it's kind of backed away from this kind of stance in recent years, saying that Taiwan is already independent. And so there's not a need to declare independence. But for China, the red line is shifting. It's always just whatever they say it is. And so any move I think that Taiwan does is seen as provocative by China. So for example, the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, tries to maintain the status quo, not pushing for independence because of the fact that this would cause her and her administration to be viewed as provocative. But then China will still say this is provocative, etc. I think just anything that is not unification for China is seen as provocative.
So what do left thinkers in Taiwan say about the possibility of this attack? For instance, does the left want the U.S. to come to Taiwan's aid militarily if that attack happens?
The funny thing is that there's not actually a lot of discussion of this currently among the left. I think the left is oftentimes in Taiwan much more focused on domestic issues. For example, let's say treatment of migrant workers in Taiwan, or LGBTQ issues, or labor issues. It's one of the ways in which I think invasion is not actually seen as something that's an immediate threat. But that is also a divide in the left, that there is a pro-unification left and a pro-independence left. The pro-unification left is more identified with China, often idealizes China as a socialist utopia, which it is clearly not. And the pro-independence left then is trying to articulate a path forward for Taiwan that is not just relying on the US to counter China, because we know the US has its own agenda in terms of backing Taiwan. And the US did, after all, back the authoritarian rule of the KMT for decades. And that was in the pattern of these right-wing dictatorships that the US propped up to counter China. And so that's what we're trying to do in that sense, trying to articulate what a pro-independence left viewpoint would look like.
Now, I first saw your name as a critic of a panel that the Democratic Socialists of America held last fall about China. And I myself had written an article with criticism. Perhaps you could repeat some of the things you said in that article.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the DSA, particularly as one of the most prominent left organizations in the US now, has had a failure of internationalism. I think there's this attempt to work out these problems that has not really resulted in standing in solidarity with oppressed nations, or allowing for the path, support of the principle of self-determination, let's say. Instead, one has this kind of idealization of China that prevails, I think, unfortunately, among a lot of segments of the Western left. And so then Taiwan is seen only in these terms as phrased by China. It doesn't matter what Taiwanese people think or feel, or what their views on what their future should be. It's just seen as, well, the Taiwan is only backed by the US to counter China. It doesn't matter what the people there think. It's insignificant in comparison to China. And then China can sometimes be also idealized as part of these viewpoints, as something as better than the US, without taking into account that it is also seen as an empire by other countries in the region who are more directly at the end of threats from China, geopolitically, etc. And that is not even to mention the discontents from workers within China, or oppressed groups, or the crackdown on feminists and LGBTQ activists, etc. And so I think a lot of what the DSA and other groups like that, what it shows is this kind of lack of internationalism, of seeing other countries only in light of the US influence there, or seeing the specter of the US everywhere. For example, framing the Hong Kong protests as only US, in a US attempt at creating color revolutions to overthrow China, that sort of thing.
So one of the speakers was Vijay Prashad, who works for a Chinese university, and he was all about geopolitics, seeing the US as the master manipulator and responsible for every challenge to Chinese policy.
That's right. Yeah, I think Vijay Prashad's viewpoint on the world is just uncritical campism, idealizing China to counter the US. When I think that what particularly, let's say, I'm looking for is a way forward that does not rely on great power competition, relying on one power against the another. And so I think for leftists such as him, they have really thrown their, let's say, put all their eggs in one basket, which is China, and just seeing that as the way to counter the US. They see US hegemony as the greatest threat to the world and the only threat, without really understanding that there can be more than one empire in the world at the time. And that doesn't mean that one is good and the other is bad, that they may be both bad. I think that kind of critical thinking actually is something that is lacking in many elements of the left.
Another speaker was Marxian professor Richard Wolff, and he kept praising China because of its explosive GDP growth, and saying nothing about the rights of Chinese workers.
Yeah, that's right. And that also does not surprise me, because I think that it's actually a little ironic from a so-called Marxian economist to frame things in terms of productivity and GDP and these very capitalist terms. Doesn't it take into account that those who are left behind by China's development, the incredible unevenness, the inequality that exists between workers in Chinese factories and these giant billionaires or whatever, or members of the CCP that are themselves quite wealthy. What also doesn't take into account is that GDP growth is highest in countries that suffer historically from uneven development. And so when they catch up, GDP growth can be quite spectacular. And so I think it reflects this very first world viewpoint, actually. I mean, if one flips it around, for example, he kept talking about how big China's economy was, but you think about how much larger China's economy is compared to the population of China is compared to the US. And when you think about it in those terms, actually, that China is only now catching up to the US despite having like 4 or 5 times the population. That means it's a tremendously inefficient economy. And I think that's the paradox that Wolf did not take into account.
Right. I mean, there's millions and millions of apartments, empty apartments. When you talk about inefficiency, I mean, that's millions
Absolutely.
of empty apartments.
Absolutely. And I think that just is one of those things that is dismissed. I mean, for example, there's a claim that circulates among these very pro-China leftists that these ghost cities do not exist, that they're just something from Western propaganda. And you really need to just step out of like a first-tier city in China, and they are there, they exist. And they could just go see that with their own eyes if they tried, but that does not happen.
For my part, in my article that I published on rpm.world, I complained that in 2 hours of the panel, no one said the words Uyghur, Hong Kong, labor unions, billionaires, coal plants, exploitation, or Taiwan.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't surprise. I think just the attempt is made to idealize China, and it's not taken account to that. For example, there are minority groups that are oppressed, or that China has its own geopolitical targets that are in the end of threats. And so it's ironic because these leftists then are very critical of for example, in the US, police brutality and things like that. And then they will justify that in Hong Kong, that this is different, that these are quote unquote socialist police. Or that in a time in which Black Lives Matter spotlights these racial inequalities in the US, then there's not discussion of, for example, the treatment of Uyghurs or Tibetans in China. And that's just paradoxical. It's seen as just one country. One country is perfect and the other is terrible. And it can't be seen that both have the same systemic issues, which I think ultimately stem from global capitalism. I think a lot of times in terms of the US or China, one sees convergent behavior. China also uses US war on terror rhetoric to justify the imprisonment of Uyghurs, for example. And I think that is just also ignored.
Now, last week, The Nation magazine had what I thought was a very good article about the left and China. And again, there was a discussion of the DSA. It noted that the DSA would not condemn the destruction of the democracy movement in Hong Kong.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's one of the paradoxes, just that, well, it's not our business, we shouldn't get involved. But unfortunately, if you're a US leftist, the US, it is everywhere, but you cannot only just stand against only the US's actions. I mean, I think being an internationalist, you also have to criticize things carried out by other governments. And I think a lot of times it is then just this insularity of seeing the US as the only actor, and then seeing other actors in the world that carry out repression of labor movements and dismissing that as just propaganda of the US to smear other governments, other rivals in terms of geopolitical contestation. And so I think that's ironic. I mean, I think that leftism, I mean, historically in the past century, and let's say the 20th century, we've seen a failure of internationalism, but this continues in the present in this kind of idealization of China, or will condemn China's actions. And this occurs despite something as large scale as the crackdown in Hong Kong or the imprisonment of Uyghurs, etc.
Now, the article talked about two very different collectives. One is Lausan, and the other is Qiao. Could you talk about both?
Yeah, so I'm part of Lausan, though I don't do the most necessarily. One of many members. I just help with some technical stuff, really. But then it is formed in the wake of the Hong Kong protests in 2019, particularly among diaspora, attempt to build these ties of international solidarity between the protests there and the social movements there and the rest of the world. And that is a similar mission to New Bloom, which was founded in 2014 after a social movement as well in Taiwan. And so we're similar in that way. Qiao is a different group. It was formed in response to Lausan, more or less. It originated from just a few social media accounts on Twitter.
From what? I didn't hear.
A few social media accounts on Twitter. Yeah, I mean, it was actually originally a personal account that then rebranded itself as a collective in response to Lausan. And then it did seem to pick up some members after that, though it's not always clear who they are. They don't always reveal their identities and so forth, though they do seem to have ties with certain groups such as the PSL. And so they are idealizing of China. They claim that there's no such thing as the treatment of Uyghurs, for example, the imprisonment in these quote unquote re-education camps. They defend the actions of the Hong Kong police. They claim that the actions of protesters in Hong Kong are US backed. And oftentimes they're cheerleading the brutal actions of the Hong Kong police when they are critical of police brutality in the US without criticizing both. And so that's how this kind of conflict between the collectives originated.
Now, we've mentioned the word Uyghurs a number of times. You're much closer to Northwest China, and we are here in Connecticut. So what would you say about the treatment of Uyghurs by the Chinese government?
Yeah, it's in line with the treatment of quote-unquote ethnic minorities in China, groups that are minorities and are not Han, of the Han majority. In this case, it also particularly has to do with that they are majority Muslim. And so there's fear that having a separate religion, a separate racial identity would lead to separatism, trying to split off from China. And so that is what is used to justify the crackdown. And this is a policy that is accelerated under Xi Jinping. But it is interesting in that sense that it uses the US war on terror rhetoric after 9/11, that these are terrorists, we're trying to fight terrorism, to crack down on these violent incidents, or to claim that this is for the purpose of economic development, that this is just providing education opportunities for Uyghurs. And so it is quite terrifying times in which, for example, if you have a relative that has gone overseas, that person you might be arrested.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. If you have a relative?
Relative, yes, that has gone overseas, you might be arrested. Or just other very tenuous ties. It is quite wide sweeping. And there are other horror stories that emerge, for example, that Han men are being assigned to stay in the homes and sleep in the same beds as Uyghur women. And just there's attempts to encourage intermarriage to just eradicate this kind of separate ethnic identity and so forth. And so this kind of treatment is nothing new from China, which is a colonial state similar to the US, etc., settler colonial, kind of pushing out indigenous populations, etc. And so this kind of treatment of ethnic minorities goes way back. I mean, one can see this, just the roots of this going back to the Mao era. And so this is the kind of continuation of that.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.